Please, a little control. The guest I have tonight and subsequent nights is maybe the most, in many ways, one of the most popular guests I've ever had on. If we didn't already have the word polymath, that's spelled P-O-L-Y-M-A-T-H, that means somebody who knows a lot about a lot of things. We would have to invent it to describe Jonathan Miller, the brilliant Jonathan Miller. Jonathan is he's a doctor, a writer, a creator, a performer of television shows. He's a director of plays and operas. If he didn't have to sleep 8 hours a night, he would probably do many other things as well. When he was on the show the last time, we talked a little about his newest book, which is called The Body in Question. It's a fascinating account of the human body, development of medical knowledge about it. And it's based on Jonathan's own BBC television series, which we're still hoping to see here on PBS. And now that I have used this word polymath, I have this awful image of Jonathan coming out in drag as a woman named Polly Math. I wish my mind didn't work that way. We have to remember, of course, that he was a member of Beyond the Fringe, and in addition to everything else, he's a very funny man. And tonight and subsequent nights, I'll be talking with him. And it'll be a treat for me, and certainly for you. Have I gone on long enough? Here is Dr. Jonathan Miller. There's a little time left. Polymath is probably pronounced Plymouth in Britain.
Yes, it's like Chumley.
Chumley, very good. Jonathan, you have fascinated my viewers to the point where there's almost no way of describing it. Incidentally, that's a word I found out that has the base of, do you know what fascinate comes from?
No, I don't. I don't know that.
I hear it so much that I finally looked it up, and it has to do with a bewitching amulet in the shape of a phallus.
Ah.
And this is what you've done to my viewers.
I haven't got mine at the moment.
Anyway, there we are. Last time we talked a lot about medical subjects, obviously, and something you're talking about backstage. Where you live, are there as many substitutes for orthodox medicine and psychiatry, the Ests and the what you call the fringe medicine, I think, and the herbals and the...
I don't think there's quite as much as there is in America. But then I think that for the same reason there isn't quite as much in the way of odd religions as you have in America. And I think that the enormous proliferation of very odd and peculiar forms of medicine can be thought of in the same context as the proliferation of very peculiar sects, which have always been a feature of American life. But of course there are, and there's a growing amount of odd forms of medicine in England, I think for the same reasons that there are in America. There is I think it's rather complicated, but I think that on the one hand there's a flight from reason, a flight from science, and also there is a protest against the invasion of the body by experts. I often think that a lot of the natural medicine movement is a sort of national liberation movement on the part of individuals who are trying to, as it were, remove the foreign invader of the scientist from their own territory. And people are sort of taking up a position of a national liberation movement, feeling that they've been taken over and that their territory, their interiors, been appropriated by experts, and they want to get them out and treat themselves, or treat themselves by methods which are understandable by themselves.
Have you ever seen anything that you took to be a true example of faith healing, inexplicable cures?
No, I don't think I've ever seen it, as it were, specially marked out as such. But I think you see it all the time in the practice of ordinary medicine. Practically all successful orthodox medicine is based on the expectation on the part of the patient that they're going to get well as a result of what happens. And as we know, you can use blank tablets or distilled water, which is colored pink, and in about 25 or 30% of cases, the patient will improve as a result. And this is because the patient expects a favorable outcome. And hope and expectation are very, very useful, so that faith is at least half of the practice of ordinary medicine. The doctor who entered looking glum would in fact probably undermine the effectiveness of his own cure, even if in fact the drugs he had at his disposal were very effective. The patient would somehow withhold his or her recovery, not knowingly, but if the patient didn't expect to get well, even if the drug were effective, they might in fact not recover.
There was a quote in your book about illness is not something that happens to us, but a decision we make
as a result of something.
As a result of something that happens to us?
Well, yes, I think that all illness, of course, there are certain illnesses where, in fact, the decision is taken out of our hands. We are simply felled by some force majeure, which you simply couldn't do anything about. You have a stroke or some sort of cardiac arrest, and you're taken into hospital helpless, and it's not your decision. But nevertheless, when someone is making up their mind about whether they're going to become a patient or not, they're making a decision as to whether or not the pains, the embarrassments, the disablement, or whatever, are enough to merit converting themselves from an active person into a passive patient. And in making this transition from being a person who helps themselves into someone who in fact is being helped, hopefully, by others, by experts, you have to undergo some sort of passage. And in making this passage, you have to go through some sort of ritual transition which marks both to yourself and to others that you have made the transition. It's very similar, in fact, to what the anthropologists note that goes on in all the transitions that occur in ordinary social life. In making the transition from, say, childhood to adolescence, there are rites of passage which mark to the community at large that I'm changing my role, I'm becoming someone else. And I think that the person who in fact falls ill has to make some sort of outward sign to the community and has to undergo rituals of transition which indicate that falling ill is happening. Now, I mean, you get this in a very primitive way sometimes in tribal villages, where a person who feels ill and has taken the decision to fall ill as a result of feeling ill will actually do something like they will cover themselves with ashes, they will retire into a hut, they will raise their voice to a falsetto level, although it's not in fact the result of the illness, but in order to mark to the community at large, I am now a sick person to whom in fact help is due. And as soon as they start to recover, the voice drops 3 octaves, they wash themselves, and they make the transition back to active person again. Well, there's much the same sort of thing goes on in hospital. Although there is a rational and expedient reason for people being washed as they enter hospital, being put into pajamas and having notes taken, there also is a symbolic function that the person in entering hospital undergoes rites of passage by which he, as it were, acknowledges to himself and to his relatives and to the community in the hospital that I am now a patient and you may do with me what you wish. And therefore the whole ritual of being admitted, the whole ritual of being washed, of having the, as it were, the dirt of the street removed and then being put into your pajamas marks out to the hospital, I am now submitting to your regime. And it may well be that patients are harder to handle, harder to almost to manage in the hospital if they don't go through that ritual. Doctors, I think, often find it very awkward to examine patients who are still in their street clothes. They like them to be in the ritual garment of the patient.
But couldn't the patient say, I don't want to go through these things, I want to be in my own bathrobe or raincoat or whatever because I don't want to feel like a patient?
Well, I think when that happens, the doctor and the nurses very often say, he's a very awkward one, this one. Watch out. Very awkward. He's got a will of his own. And I think that it is when the patient very quietly submits that the nurses always say, he's very nice, this one. And what they really mean is that he is submitting to the regime, he's undergoing the rites of passage, he is agreeing to be a patient. Now, it may well be that one of the ways in which a patient actually has a prosperous career in a hospital is by submitting. But of course also, he or she loses a large part of their individuality.
What kind of patient would you be, knowing all this and having been a doctor?
Well, it's very strange. As soon as you become ill, I mean, this is speaking for myself. As soon as I become ill, I instantly forget that I am a doctor, and instantly go through this ritual and submit myself totally for the slaughter. And I let them do anything at all. I mean, whether it's dentistry or medicine.
You mean you don't do those things that authors of books like, there's a doctor who wrote a book, Mendelssohn, about medical heresy. You don't take a stand and say, look, when was this X-ray machine last inspected, and how do I know I need this?
Oh, no, I just simply open myself to it all. And just say, don't hurt me too much, and that really is all I ever do.
But if they wanted to fluoroscope you from head to foot and so on, and
shine it on me, I'd say. The only thing I ever asked and used medical privilege for was when I was being fluoroscoped once for a suspected ulcer, gastric ulcer, and they were fluoroscoping the barium swallow, which is really like eating a sort of puree of tombstone, you know. And I was taking this stuff, and I said, what I've always wanted to do is to see my own interior. I'm absolutely unacquainted with my inside. I'd like to see how I do inside and how skillfully I am at peristalsis, you see. And
you asked for a mirror.
I asked for the screen to be moved round, you see. And I swallowed the tombstone and then watched this thing percolating down. And I discovered a very interesting fact, that once I could see my own intestine, I could wink my duodenum. And it's almost by closing the feedback loop. Now, I mean, thinking now, concentrating upon my duodenum, or trying to do so, I wouldn't really quite know what it was I had to do, or whether I had succeeded or failed. I mean, I could go, it's going now, but I wouldn't have any idea whether I'd pulled it off or not, you see.
Yeah.
But now, I had the screen in front of me, and I could see the tombstone stuff going through, and then I could see this little sphincter, the exit to my stomach, and by concentrating on trying to make that visual image change, I found that I gained control over it. So I suppose this is what you call biofeedback. Once you actually are able to visualize what it is you thought you previously had no control over, you begin to acquire some sort of control. And I'm now really quite a skillful winker of duodenums. I mean,
you know that in all these years I have never had anyone on who even claimed to be able to wink his duodenum, and
well, it could spread and could become a fashion now.
There isn't much call for it at parties,
there isn't,
though,
but it could
there?
get you into a lot of trouble, you know.
Yes, especially if you wink at the wrong person. Well, were you winking your duodenum at my wife? That is wonderful. You wanted to see inside yourself.
Well, that was the only time when I'd actually, as it were, taken advantage of medical privilege. I mean, I think that you know, the uninitiated patient is not allowed to look at his own duodenum.
No, most people have no idea that they have one.
And that goes right back to this question of the possession and appropriation of the interior. Your interior is only on lease to you. It really belongs to the medical profession, and therefore the doctor always says, if the patient makes an inquiry, I'd like to see my own duodenum so I could wink at it, the doctor will always say in England, leave that to us. As far as you're concerned, your duodenum is really none of your business at all, and we certainly don't want you winking it.
Not on our part.
Allow us to wink it for you, you see.
I have a phobic fear of radiation. Do you not sit there thinking these X-rays are killing me?
No, I'm really not frightened of. I'm not really frightened of illness.
You mentioned that last time.
I am a physical coward. I'm frightened. I'm frightened of being beaten up. I don't like the idea of that. Or indeed the reality of that.
You'd prefer not to be beaten up?
I prefer not to be. If given in a multiple choice thing, I would say I would put the oblique straight. Say I would rather not be beaten up
than the opposite.
That's right. Well, I'd probably make a mistake on the oblique stroke and say I would rather be beaten up. I'm sorry, no, I'd rather not be beaten up. I'd rather not be beaten up. I also, as I once said on the sleeve of the Beyond the Fringe record, my greatest nightmare is being tortured for information which I never had in the first place. You know? Look, how can I satisfy you? I have to confabulate some story. But I am a physical coward, and I am frightened of all those sort of things, and I'm very frightened of sports which involve a great deal of violence and hitting, and I try not to go in for them. Although I did at school have to go in for them. At my private school, there was a terrible competition which used to be instituted once a year, which was a competition, a cup, a challenge cup, which every single boy in the school had to enter for. And there was this Darwinian struggle, you see, from which finally emerged a blood-stained winner. But every single boy in the school was obliged to enter for this contest, and you were every year you were drawn against an opponent. And every year, for some reason, because my weight matched, I was drawn against the same opponent, who was a very enthusiastic pugilist called H.E.V. Jones. And I would see H.E.V. Jones in the 6 weeks before the contest was convened and would try to be nice to him in the corridor and say, you know, can we, you know, just walk round this contest and just fudge it a little bit, you know. and avoid the hitting part. And he said, no, the hitting part was really a basic element of it, and he wanted to get into the hitting part as soon as possible. And
perhaps even at that moment.
Well, no, he wanted to save it up, so, and he was training too, you see. And the only way in which and you see, having this long nose, I was really very much at risk. But finally, the only way I could get around it was by footwork. And what I did was to bewilder him enormously by an enormous amount of what looked like extremely skillful, very aristocratic footwork. And it used to be there was a great deal of this sort. It was enormously stylish.
It is bewildering.
It's bewildering, and also it has an enormously, it has a very stylish look to it. You see, I mean, it was very elegant, and it was choreographed. You see, and
you seem to know what you're doing.
I knew what I was doing, you see, but then he knew much more what he was doing, because he obviously received a lot of advice in the gap between the first and second rounds, you see, and they said, ignore his footwork, go for his nose, you see. And then there was this, in the second round, I'd walk out and do more of this Nureyev stuff, you see, and he went straight for my nose, and there was this wonderful smell of aluminium as and I was out, and it happened exactly the same every year.
Oh, is this not the original Miller nose then?
No, he never broke it, in fact. But it was the same every year. The second round, he really understood the footwork and went straight for the nose, and I gave up the contest at that point. So I've always been frightened of that sort of injury, and I've always been frightened of the hard ball in cricket. In fact, at school, I used to join a thing called, it was the chuck-out game, the Jewish chuck-out game, it was called, in which Jewish intellectuals who did not want to be struck on the nose by the hard ball in cricket used to read Proust in the long grass, you see. And occasionally, rather flutily, throw the ball back, you know, and then get on with the Proust, you see. So I've always avoided that sort of contest. But on the other hand, illness, for some reason, I don't regard as that sort of injury. I suppose if I was to think of it as something inflicted by God, and that God was really trying to go for my nose, I think probably I'd be frightened in the same way. But I can't imagine the sort of footwork I would have to use in order to avoid God, you know, in order to get out
spiritual
of that.
Footwork. Spiritual footwork. Kind. Yeah.
So although I don't like the idea of dying of some hideous disease, it isn't something which I wake at night thinking, God, the radiation's getting me. I'm getting growths all over myself.
It's that hardball more than...
It's the hardball and the boxing.
Is that because that inflicts instant pain, or is it not that simple?
Well, it's instant pain. It's the abruptness of the injury. It's the feeling of my knowing that certain bones are actually breaking at that moment. And I have a very acute and accurate visual image of splinters coming through the skin from inside, which is where I least like them to come. And
yet they always do.
And it's that I can't.
Yeah. Does this go, now your father was a psychiatrist. Would he feel that this was something worth examining deeply in you?
No, I don't think I ever told him that I was that much of a coward. He was quite a sportsman when he was a young man. He played football a lot, and I think he enjoyed that. But I've always avoided. I'm amazed by my sons, you see. My eldest son has absolutely no physical fear at all. He has to run the gauntlet at his school. He goes to a public school in England, I mean public school in your sense, and runs the gauntlet of a very violent school. And he's been at the school now for 6 years, and he's not frightened of it at all. But my younger son is terrified of it in exactly the same way as I am. So that it's something, he's got the bad genes and the other one's got the good ones, you see.
Does this occur in your dreams ever? Do you still see H.E.V., what's his name?
Don't ever see H.E.V. Jones in dreams. I once saw H.E.V. Jones about 20 years later after school, and he was doing very badly in business, so I was rather pleased to see.
Taking it on the nose.
That's right, the footwork paid off, you see, after a long time. I said, if only you'd learnt footwork, Jones, you see, you'd be doing much better than you are.
Did he recognize you as the...
Yes, he did recognize me.
Favorite target?
Yes, he did. And again, as always happens with the passage of time, and if you've been on television, they get terribly nice to you, you see. They say, I'm sorry I hit you on the nose. That's all right, Jones. That's all right. quite all right, Jones. Don't think another thing of it.
Last time when you were here, you talked about fascinating after effects of strokes in which people did not find their hand as something that belonged to their own body, but something that the night nurse might have brought in and left there, and that kind of thing. Do you know anything about something I only learned about a couple of years ago called Gilles de la Tourette syndrome?
Yes, indeed. I have a friend who works here in New York who is writing a book on Gilles de la Tourette.
Is that the name of the doctor who
name of the French physician,
originally
19th century,
defined it in some way?
Who noticed this? Yes, this is the eruption of often of sounds and swearing, and the patient has tics, uncontrollable suites of tics. But you really ought to talk to this chap, Dr. Sachs, about it. He has a most wonderful account of it. He wrote a very beautiful book about a group of patients somewhere up in the Bronx who the people who'd been left over from the sleeping sickness epidemic of 1920 and who were woken up with a drug after 30 or 40 years. And he wrote this marvelous book called Awakenings, which is really all about these people.
Real Rip Van Winkle.
That's right. And they woke up talking in flapper lingo. Of their time. And he's very interested in that sort of abnormality. And he's done a lot of work on Gilles de la Tourette's disease. And so made a little film about it as well.
Tourette syndrome, it's called. Do you ever feel you have gotten to the bottom of that age-old question of where the brain leaves off and the mind begins? It's one that I keep coming back to all the time, and I suppose it has to do with the idea of surviving death. There must be something there other than just the organic substances, only because if the mind can become aware of itself, then it must be different from...
well, in a sense, of course...
I'm starting to get lost.
No, I mean, it almost goes without saying that, of course, there's something there apart from the brain, because the very fact that there is a topic of imagination to talk about means that there is something apart from physical brain. The question is whether, in fact, this thing that we call mind can exist and has some sort of credible existence independently of the substance which is there inside the head. Now, I don't think that this is so. I do think that mind states are, in fact, the result of brain states, that what happens in the brain is what produces what happens in what we call the mind. But I don't think that, therefore, we have to think that minds are things which, like a steam which comes off the surface of boiling water, is something which you could find independently of a brain, and like steam left over after cooking, is floating around the world after death. And I don't believe that one could survive bodily death, not because I think that it's physically impossible, although I think it is, but also because I think it doesn't really make logical sense. I'm not quite certain what a personality would be if there weren't a body to be attached to. After one of the things which you think of when you think of yourself is the fact that you have a physical location, that you're here rather than there, and that you're tall rather than short, or that you're the shape that you are rather than another shape. And all of those things which define being yourself and are to do with, in fact, being located in a physique. And I'm not certain I could even begin to make sense of having a personality which wasn't attached to a here-ness rather than a there-ness. And that does seem to be having a body.
We say that you can travel in your mind at this moment to Paris.
No, but you're not traveling in your mind. What you're doing, you're traveling in your mind in your imaginary body to Paris. When I imagine myself in Paris, I don't imagine myself as a disembodied floating eye, or even if I do imagine an eye, that's already imagining something physical. I don't imagine. Yes, I don't. Or no. I mean, an optical eye. I mean, when I imagine myself in Paris, I imagine myself at a particular place in Paris, looking at Paris from one point of view rather than another, and therefore already, in thinking of it in that way, I am already borrowing the vocabulary of having a body, because I'm there looking at it from one particular point of view rather than another.
Are there things in medicine that you wouldn't do to your body? Shock therapy, drug therapies, things that you simply are superstitious about, or know that you are harmful in some way, or feel that they're...
Well, I'm much more pessimistic about myself in medicine. I mean, in the sense that if I ever really got seriously ill, I would, on the whole, I think, say to the doctors, throw me in the dustbin rather than treat me. Not because I suspect what doctors do, but because I'm pessimistic about the outcome in very serious illness, and I would rather not go through the ordeal of prolonged and elaborate treatment. I'd rather get off the bus altogether and say, right, that's it.
How do you get off the bus or into the dustbin?
Well, just simply by not, in fact, undertaking the treatment. I mean, that's not because I regard what doctors have to offer as bad. I mean, a lot of my life was devoted to assuming that it was good.
Yeah.
But I'm personally very pessimistic about it. With regard to myself, I think, on the whole, that in a medical draw or lottery, I'd do badly. That's all.
Is that luck, though? Is that something like you would encourage your wife, I assume, to take all advantage?
Oh yes, I would encourage her to take advantage of it. But I think that I also do think that doctors are overconfident in their use of drugs and surgery. And are perhaps not reticent enough, not modest enough to say, well, let's just see if this can't be treated in a rather conservative way, rather than in a rather heroic way. And the heroism is all on the part of the patient, never on the part of the doctor, although the doctors always talk about their heroism in using these procedures. So that it isn't, as it were, that I would suspect major surgery because I think it's bad, but because I just have a faint suspicion about any major intervention in the body.
But you'd have your gallbladder out, wouldn't you, if you were told you had to?
Yes, I suppose I probably would. But I've seen so many of the complications that go with surgery. I've seen so many of the complications which go with elaborate drug therapy. I mean, what are called, rather gaily, side effects are in fact part of the effects of the drug. It's part of the vocabulary of medicine that you call those side effects as if they're sort of trivial epiphenomena, but they're part of what, in fact, that drug is doing. Of course, the doctor is bound to choose the salient effect, because that's what he's trying to use the drug for. But I've seen things go wrong too often to be overconfident.
Well, on that
yes, what is that heavenly music which is coming in now? I thought I was having a seizure of some sort.
It's somewhere... I don't hear any music. Jonathan, we will see you next time, and we will see you next time as we continue to probe the epidermis and what's below it of Jonathan Miller. See you then. Thank you and good night. This is what you've done to my viewers.
I haven't got mine at the moment.
Anyway, there we are. Last time we talked a lot about medical subjects, obviously, and something you're talking about backstage. Where you live, are there as many substitutes for orthodox medicine and psychiatry, the Ests and the what you call the fringe medicine, I think, and the herbals and the...
I don't think there's quite as much as there is in America. But then I think that for the same reason there isn't quite as much in the way of odd religions as you have in America. And I think that the enormous proliferation of very odd and peculiar forms of medicine can be thought of in the same context as the proliferation of very peculiar sects, which have always been a feature of American life. But of course there are, and there's a growing amount of odd forms of medicine in England. I think for the same reasons that there are in America. There is I think it's rather complicated.
Please, a little control. The guest I have tonight and subsequent nights is maybe the most, in many ways, one of the most popular guests I've ever had on. If we didn't already have the word polymath, that's spelled P-O-L-Y-M-A-T-H, that means somebody who knows a lot about a lot of things. We would have to invent it to describe Jonathan Miller, the brilliant Jonathan Miller. Jonathan is he's a doctor, a writer, a creator, a performer of television shows. He's a director of plays and operas. If he didn't have to sleep 8 hours a night, he would probably do many other things as well. When he was on the show the last time, we talked a little about his newest book, which is called The Body in Question. It's a fascinating account of the human body, a development of medical knowledge about it. And it's based on Jonathan's own BBC television series, which we're still hoping to see here on PBS. And now that I have used this word polymath, I have this awful image of Jonathan coming out in drag as a woman named...
Ordinary medicine. Practically all successful orthodox medicine is based on the expectation on the part of the patient that they're going to get well as a result of what happens. And as we know, you can use blank tablets or distilled water, which is colored pink, and in about 25 or 30% of cases, the patient will improve as a result. And this is because the patient expects a favorable outcome. And hope and expectation are very, very useful, so that faith is at least half of the practice of ordinary medicine. The doctor who entered looking glum would in fact probably undermine the effectiveness of his own cure, even if in fact the drugs he had at his disposal were very effective. The patient would somehow withhold his or her recovery, not knowingly, but if the patient didn't expect to get well, even if the drug were effective, they might in fact not recover.
Polymath. I wish my mind didn't work that way. We have to remember, of course, that he was a member of Beyond the Fringe, and in addition to everything else, he's a very funny man. And tonight and subsequent nights, I'll be talking with him, and it'll be a treat for me, and certainly for you. Have I gone on long enough? Here is Dr. Jonathan Miller. There's a little time left. Polymath is probably pronounced Plymouth in Britain.
Yes, it's like Chumley.
Chumley, very good. Jonathan, you have fascinated my viewers to the point where there's almost no way of describing it. Incidentally, that's a word I found out that has to the base of. Do you know what fascinate comes from?
No, I don't. I don't know that.
I hear it so much that I finally looked it up, and it has to do with a bewitching amulet in the shape of a phallus.
Ah.
And this...
But I think that on the one hand, there's a flight from reason, a flight from science, and also there is a protest against the invasion of the body by experts. I often think that a lot of the natural medicine movement is a sort of national liberation movement on the part of individuals who are trying to, as it were, remove the foreign invader of the scientist from their own territory. And people are sort of taking up a position of a national liberation movement, feeling that they've been taken over and that their territory, their interiors, been appropriated by experts, and they want to get them out and treat themselves, or treat themselves by methods which are understandable by themselves.
Have you ever seen anything that you took to be a true example of faith healing, inexplicable cures?
No, I don't think I've ever seen it, as it were, specially marked out as such, but I think you see it all the time in the practice of